Okay, welcome back. At the end of last time, we were saying that uh, philosophy, we're going to think of it as addressing a certain type of problem. We're going to be in this problem solving mood. And then we sort of left open the question of, well, what sorts of problems are we talking about? And if we think about, say, science, science seems also to be in the business of answering questions. And so then the natural question to ask is, well, uh, how is philosophy then different from science? Right? How does philosophy go about its task of problem solving? Is the method of problem solving different? Are the problems themselves different? There are a number of ways you might try to go about this distinction. We're going to focus more on the first way, that there's something different about the method of answering these questions. Now, if you think about some typical scientific sort of case, right? Take some scientific question like, I don't know, the melting point of palladium, right? Palladium, one of those metals on the periodic table that you probably haven't thought a whole lot about. I certainly haven't thought a lot about palladium. Um, Now, if I were going to try to answer this question of the melting point of palladium, right, what am I going to do? Um, well, I'm going to go get my hands on some palladium, right? And I'm going to need access to some heating supplies, and I'm going to experiment, and I'm going to try to figure out, based on those experiments, what the melting point of palladium might be, right? And so if I'm a good scientist, I'm probably going to do several experiments. I might try different types of heating apparatuses to make sure that there's nothing weird about one particular heating apparatus that's biasing my results. I might try it in different environments. Um, the melting point is typically defined, I believe, at some sort of standard pressure output, standard pressure in the ambient air or in the material itself. And so I want to try to, make sure I've got that sorted out right. I want to make sure that, I've got some normal palladium, right, that I haven't stumbled onto some weird, I don't know, maybe some unusual isotope of palladium that has weird properties or something, right? But in general, I'm going to do experiments and make observations. That is sort of the heart of the scientific method, right? I am doing experiments, I am constructing hypotheses, I am experimenting in order to test those hypotheses. And the nature of the experiments are sensory, right? I am using my five senses in order to do science, in order to test my hypotheses, in order to make measurements. And those observations play a role in shaping my scientific theories. Okay? Palladium, right? It may seem like a sort of abstraction or something, but it's a metal, right? It's this thing out there in the world. And if I want to know about it, I'm going to go get some of it and I'm going to play around with it. I'm going to poke at it. I'm going to heat it up. Whether or not I want to know its melting point, heating it up is a good way to experiment with it. I'm going to cool it. I'm going to try to see if I can stretch it. Maybe I'll try to see if I can cut it. Right? Maybe I can see if it'll bond with other sorts of chemical substances. All the sorts of things that I might do in order to learn about palladium. Okay. Now, the question before us, right, is going to be, well, how is philosophy like that, or how is philosophy not like that? Now, I want to pause before we get into this, and I want to point out that if you're thinking about, say, the melting point of palladium, there is almost no one, I won't say quite no one, but there is almost no one who would deny that, right? There is some melting point of palladium. There is some fact of the matter. There is some answer, some objective answer to the question of what the melting point of palladium is, right? We may not know what it is. I don't know what it is. I guess we could screen here and we'll open up a new tab. And melting point of palladium, okay? And, oh, wow, that's That's high. This says 2,831 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. I don't know. Are you guys seeing this? I don't know if you can see this. Let me just make sure. Okay, there we go. I think I'm sharing now. Right, melting point of palladium, 2,831 degrees. Right, well, I didn't know that. Gee, that's a lot. But on the other hand, I guess, this is a metal. It's a hard metal, so probably it's going to have a pretty high melting point. Okay, so now we know the melting point of palladium. Um, and there it is, right? There was some fact that I just learned. Right? The fact was sort of, as it were, out there. It was true independently of me. It was true independently of human beings. It's a fact about that metal, right? And presumably it was a fact about that metal before human beings ever came along in the first place, right? Presumably palladium is older than we are. And if you think about the Earth at the time of the dinosaurs or something, well, there's palladium then. Right? It's probably all buried underground somewhere in various deposits. Right? Maybe it's in ores or in various compounds or whatever. There's palladium in the Earth. And it was true even then, one would think, that the melting point of palladium is 2,800, whatever it was, degrees Fahrenheit. Right? Nobody could know it. There wasn't even anybody around to know it. But it seems to have been a fact just then as it is now. It's a fact about palladium that's when it starts to melt, given certain assumptions about pressure and whatever else we need. Okay. Now, that sort of attitude, right? That attitude that there are facts out there in the world, that science is seeking to discover, right? That ground the correct answers to these questions about substances and everything else that science describes. That general attitude that there are facts out there, I'm going to call realism, right? So realism is the view that, as it were, there is a reality. There is a reality independent of human beings. And that we, when we do science or philosophy, which I'll explain in a minute, we are attempting to grab a hold of. Right? We want to know something about reality. And it's there, right? It's this thing that exists outside of us somehow. Now, in this class, when we are doing philosophy, as we will be doing soon, we are going to assume very generally a realist attitude. Okay? So we talked last time about problem solving. We are going to assume that our problems in philosophy have answers. Now, we have yet to say more about what sorts of problems we're talking about here. What are the problems of philosophy? We said that science deals with questions that have to do with the five senses. Right? Science is about experimenting. It is about observing. Now you might think, right? You might think, well, if we're talking about questions that have no connection to experiment at all or observation at all, then it's not really much of a question. You might think that. Okay? Most philosophers do not think that. Most philosophers think that there are certain kinds of questions which are real and meaningful and suggest, real answers out there in the world, even though they don't bear on observation or hypothesis testing or experimentation at all. Right? And so here we are arriving at classic philosophical questions. Classic philosophical questions are those questions that seem like they ought to have answers. And again, we're going to assume generally that they do have answers, whether we know them or not. We're going to assume that they do have answers, even though the way of arriving at those answers apparently cannot be a matter of some sort of scientific experiment or observation. And I should say, I'm taking observation in a very broad sense here. So if the question is, what is the color of Greg's shirt right now, right, and I look down and I see that it's black, Well, that's a kind of mini scientific experiment that I did. That's a kind of scientific question in this very broad sense, right? It still bears on uh, observation and sort of experimentation. I'm talking about questions for philosophy that don't touch on observation at all. So, what are the sorts of classic philosophical questions that seem to have this characteristic? Well, there are questions, for example, about ethics, right? And we'll do a unit on ethics. Is it wrong always to lie? Is it permissible to steal a loaf of bread for my family when we're all starving? Right? These are sort of ethical questions, right? What is ethics? Well, it's part of it, at least, is about the right and wrong of human action. If I'm asking whether it's always wrong to steal or whether rather it's sometimes permissible to steal, right? I'm asking a very broad question about the appropriateness of certain types of actions. And notice, right, this just doesn't seem to be a scientific question at all. I could, I could go read the Constitution. I could go study court opinions about, how laws about stealing are relevant in particular cases. But that's not really getting to the heart of the matter here, right? I might learn a lot about some countries' laws. I might learn a lot about, what certain places think justice is. But I'm trying to ask more about, as it were, justice itself, right? Of which any country's laws are just sort of an imperfect representation, right? I'm trying to ask not about how stealing gets prosecuted or what stealing looks like or what numbers of stealing look like or whether people tend to be forgiven when they steal loaves of bread when they're starving. I'm asking just this sort of natural, simple question: is it wrong? Right? And there just doesn't seem to be any sort of observation that bears on that question at all. There are also questions of what we will call epistemology. Epistemology is fundamentally about, we'll talk about this soon, the nature of knowledge. Right? What is it to have knowledge? Do I know when I have knowledge? What does it mean to have a belief that's justified? Okay. Well, those are good philosophical questions. Seem like they ought to have answers, and yet, right, it doesn't seem like there's any sort of observation or experiment that would help me to answer them. Okay. Philosophy might also deal with so-called metaphysical questions, right? Questions about what ultimately exists in the universe. So maybe I want to know whether there's a God. Is there, some personal God? Maybe a personal God who cares about whether I steal scraps of food when I'm starving, right? Or I might want to know, sort of more about me. Questions like, do I have a soul? Am I going to survive death? Right? And if you ask yourself, what sorts of observations would bear on those questions, it's hard. It's hard to think of any, right? I mean, I guess you can imagine, going to the cemetery and seeing spectral figures rise up out of the ground or something like that. Maybe that would count as some kind of evidence one way or the other, although it's hard to know, whether you're being tricked or something. And it's hard to know also whether would you be able to communicate with that spiritual thing and learn anything. There doesn't seem to be any real observation we could make that would sort of bear on those questions. And there are more humdrum metaphysical questions like, what is the nature of number? Do numbers, as used by mathematicians, do those exist in some robust way or not? Right? Do they have a kind of existence independent from human beings or not? What observation could possibly bear on that question? Probably none at all. Okay. So, the question then is, well, if that's the sort of question we're going to be dealing with in philosophy, right, where we can put away all of our scientific instruments and forget about trying to use our five senses, what are we going to do instead, right? And how do we get to assume that these questions have answers if we're not even sure what an answer would look like, or how we would arrive at some answer? And the general sort of answer is that instead of having observations and experimental evidence and things like that, philosophers have something else. They have two things. One thing is they have certain intuitions, okay, and we're going to try to explore those. You probably have intuitions. You may not have thought about them a lot, but you probably have certain sorts of philosophical intuitions that are relevant to certain types of philosophical questions. So we have those, and we also have, and this is really the bigger point for our purposes, we also have the possibility of argument. Okay, so I'll say more about arguments in the next lesson, but for now, we're just going to think about arguments as, right, what is an argument? Well, it's a set of claims. We've got some claim privileged as the conclusion, and then we have these other claims that count as starting assumptions or premises. Right? And the idea is that if we start with certain assumptions, we will be entitled by logic alone to certain conclusions. Right? Entitled by logic alone to certain conclusions. We don't need to go out and look to see whether these claims are true. We don't need to sort of gather evidence for them. We don't need to do experiments for them. We can just infer them directly given the assumptions with which we've begun. Okay? And if we connect those starting assumptions with our base intuitions, right, then we would be able to sort of spell out all the logical consequences of our intuitions. And that might help to get us some answers to these questions. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a very rough sort of example here. I'm going to start a brand new document here. All right. So let me share my screen once more. Okay. So, what sorts of intuitions are we talking about? Well, suppose we're interested in the question of, say, I don't know, capital punishment. There's a nice controversial topic for you. And I'm interested in particular in the ethics of it. And I'm interested in particular in, right, this question: is capital punishment ever, let's just say, morally justified? Okay. So maybe I go to some poet, and I say, "Hey, what do you think about capital punishment? Is it ever morally justified?" And the poet gives me some poetical answer like, put this in quotes, "Every death is tragic." Well, that's a sort of nice poetical thought there. Maybe that's nice for poetry, but in philosophy, right, we're not going to be looking for this kind of artistic, vague statement. We want to be as plain as we can, because the problems are already really hard, right? This question about whether capital punishment is ever morally justified, that's a very difficult question. We don't need to make it harder by sort of using flowery or obscure language. And so if the poet says this to me, every death is tragic, got a nice sort of meter to it, I might say, well, what does that mean? The poet might be trying to say, every death is tragic. Let's see if we can make an argument out of this. Okay, so here's my premise. Every death is tragic. Conclusion, I guess, Well, maybe we'll just sort of mark, is this the conclusion that we're supposed to be drawing? Capital punishment is never morally justified. But then the philosopher is going to come along and say, okay, but look, this conclusion doesn't follow from this premise. Right? We're not guaranteed this statement here by logic alone together with this starting assumption, every death is tragic. Right? At least certainly not unless we're a little clearer about what this premise means. Right? Tragic. What does that mean? Tragic seems to be sort of a term of, about art and literature and so on. Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. What does it mean to say that a death is a tragedy? And moreover, it just doesn't seem to be true that every death is a tragedy. Maybe I swatted a mosquito on my arm yesterday, and I don't think that was particularly tragic. In fact, I think I saved myself a lot of grief by killing that mosquito. Right? And certainly, if I'm allergic to mosquito bites, I saved myself a lot of grief, maybe even death. Right? So it doesn't seem to be true that every death is tragic. And even if we tried to sort of clean this up a bit and make it a little more clear, make it a little more philosophically respectable, still it's far from clear that we're going to be entitled to this conclusion here. Right? So we might say, well, we could try to clean this up. Instead of saying tragic, because that's sort of a vague word, let's say every death is morally wrong. Now that doesn't seem quite right either, because what's morally wrong should be somebody's action, not just something that happens. Right? So maybe we say, all right, well, maybe every killing is morally wrong. Then I bring up the mosquito again, and they say, oh yeah, okay, well, not just killing of anything at all, but every killing of a human being is morally wrong. Okay, now that's looking a bit better, right? Well, if it's really true that every killing of a human being is morally wrong, then this does seem to follow that capital punishment is never morally justified. Okay, of course, now we've built out this premise to such a degree that we might have very different views about whether this is true or not, right? Is every killing of a human being morally wrong? Not obviously true at all, right? So we can sort of go back and have further discussions about this claim. Maybe we would make this claim its own conclusion in some further argument, right? How do we get to this premise? I'm not willing to just start from that premise. Maybe we can argue for that premise. Okay? And so then we take this premise and we say, all right, I guess that's going to be my new conclusion. Right? And now I need some more premises to support that. And we can sort of talk about what those might look like and so on. Okay, that's a sort of sneak peek into the sort of thing I'm thinking about with argument. We'll have more to say about that next time. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you soon.